Welcome to Sweet Red Poppy. I'm Kim, and today we are going to be sewing up some bowl cozies. Now, this tutorial is super simple. It takes less than 20 minutes, and it can be made with 2 fat quarters. Now, bowl cozies are great for protecting your hands as well as the table from hot bowls of soup or leftovers, but they also work really well for cold items like ice cream. But before we get started sewing, let's talk a little bit about the fabric that you will need for this project, because that's a really important part to creating a bowl cozy that's microwave safe. So 100% cotton is the ideal fabric for this pattern. You'll want to choose a high quality quilting cotton, cotton batting, and cotton thread for this project. You will want to avoid anything that contains plastic or even metal, because that can be damaged in the microwave. Something that you should keep in mind is that synthetic fibers will be burnt or melted by the microwave. So just a quick warning, make sure not to warm your bowl cozy for more than 2 minutes. That way you avoid burning or even scorching your fabric. Now, my free bowl cozy sewing pattern features 3 different sizes. That way you can get the perfect fit for whatever bowl or even plate that you're using. So my small size fits most normal size bowls. I also have a medium size that's great for a larger bowl. And then my large is perfect for a plate. Now, before we get started sewing, make sure that you have washed and dried your fabric. That's really important because it's going to ensure that your fabric shrinks. It also gets rid of any chemicals that your fabric might have been treated with. Now, spills happen. Luckily, our bowl cozies are really easy to wash. If you ever need to wash your bowl cozy after it's been sewn, you'll want to make sure to wash it in cold water and then just lay it flat to dry. I would avoid using any fabric softener on the fabric when you wash it. You can give it a good pressing once it's air dried. Let's go ahead and talk about the supplies that you will need for this project. You will need quilting cotton, cotton batting, I'm using Wrap and Zap, a sewing machine, scissors or a rotary cutter and a mat, as well as an acrylic ruler, pins, an iron and ironing board, a sewing machine needle, a fabric pen or chalk. You'll need pins, a turning tool, printer paper, and tape, and a printer. Are you ready to get started? I'm just going to warn you right now that once you start sewing these cozies, you are not going to want to stop. They are highly addictive, and suddenly overnight, everyone that you know will somehow magically end up being gifted a set of bowl cozies for their entire family. So you've been warned, let's go ahead and start sewing. Step 1, print and assemble the bowl cozy sewing pattern. Download the bowl cozy sewing pattern to your computer, and then you'll want to print the pattern at 100% with no scaling. You can find a link to the pattern in the description of this video. Now, immediately check the 1 by 1 inch square just to ensure that your pattern has printed off correctly. If the 1 inch square measures either larger or smaller than the pattern, then it will need to be reprinted for accuracy. Lay the pages out in numerical order and align the stars of each page and the black lines and tape them in place. Now, once you reach a page with no stars on the left-hand side, you can move down and start a new row. Once everything is taped together, cut out the pattern along your desired size lines. I'm going to be cutting out the small size since it's going to fit a standard sized bowl. Now, here's a quick pro tip. If you plan on making this pattern over and over, I would recommend that you print it out on cardstock. That way it lasts for multiple uses. Step 2, cut out the bowl cozy fabric. Now it's time to move on to our fabric. So you'll want to iron your fabric before you cut it. That's going to ensure that you get the very best results, and it makes sure that the fabric cuts out evenly and that you don't have any wrinkles or folds. So I'm going to lay both pieces of my fabric out in front of me. And I'm using 2 different fabrics, that way you can tell what the front and the back side look like as I'm sewing. So I have 2 layers of fabric laid out in front of me. I am going to make sure to align my grain line marking on my pattern with the grain line of the fabric. That's just going to make sure that it cuts out nice and smoothly and that your fabric is on grain. That helps it to not stretch out unevenly. So you can go ahead and pin this in place. So I'm going to cut out both of these fabric pieces at the same time. I am all about saving time whenever I can, so cutting out 2 pieces of fabric is great. So I'm lining up my acrylic ruler with the edge of my pattern over here on my right hand. So with my left hand, I'm going to place some pressure on my acrylic ruler. That's just going to keep it in place. And then with my right hand, I'm going to open up my rotary cutter and cut away from myself. Now at the end of every cut, I always retract my blade. You want to be really careful with a rotary cutter. So retract, then switch your acrylic ruler to the other side. And then you can cut again. I'm going to cut this side as well. And then one more side. And remember, when you're using a rotary cutter, always cut away from yourself. That's really important so that you don't have any accidents. Okay, so we should have our little square. Check if you have any little threads that are still connected. Looks like my corner was connected. And then you can move this fabric out of the way. So now I just have my little darts that I want to cut out. And this is what's going to give my bowl cozy some shape. So cut these little guys out. Again, I'm cutting away from myself. Next up, I'm going to cut out 2 layers of my cotton batting, and I'm using Wrap and Zap. You should have 2 cotton batting pieces, so you'll have one that goes with the lining and then one that goes with your main piece of fabric. So go ahead and pin that in place and then cut it out. Step 3, transfer your pattern markings to your fabric. So I'm going to use a sewing pin to create a small little hole in each corner. So you can see I have my little sewing pin. I'm just sticking it through the corner of this square right here. I'm going to do that all the way around my pattern. This is going to help me to transfer my markings. So we are going to be quilting this in the next step. And I want to be able to transfer all of these markings to my fabric. So just mark the corners of this square. And if you're sewing one of the larger sizes, make sure you're using the square that corresponds with your size. I'm sewing the small size, so I'm using the red square. Then you can just pull this back, double check so I can see my little dot transferred there. Repeat that exact process with your lining fabric as well. Lay that out in front of you. Pull your pattern piece over, line it up with the fabric, and just draw in those little dots. Now with my acrylic ruler, I'm going to draw in that square that I have on my pattern. So I'm just going to line up both of my little dots, draw my line, and keep doing that until I have a square. So once I have my square drawn in, then I need to draw in my lines across the pattern. So I'm going to go from one corner to the other, and it should be intersecting with the lines and dots that you drew earlier. This is just going to serve as a quilting guide for us in the next step. Now repeat that exact same process. Now you won't need to transfer these markings to the batting, so we can move on to the next step. Step 4, quilt the bowl cozy pieces. Now it's time to quilt our layers together. To do this, you're going to layer your quilting cotton on top of the cotton batting and prepare it for quilting. Now go ahead and place a few pins in the middle of your fabric. This is going to hold everything together and prepare you for quilting. So next up, I'm going to pull my sewing machine over and I am going to quilt along all of my markings. So you should have a large X that goes across your entire bowl cozy as well as the square in the middle. I'm going to start out by sewing my X. So you just want to keep this line just right in the middle of your foot. And sew all the way across. You can remove your pin as you come to them. And you don't really need to worry about back stitching on this step since all of these ends will get sewn in. Go ahead and do the opposite marking. Now I'm going to work on sewing my square. So I'm going to start right here at the corner. Now, when I'm sewing my square, I like to get really nice, sharp corners. Regrettably, I am a bit of a perfectionist and I really like my sewing to look professional. So I do this by sewing until I reach the corner, and then I'm going to put my needle in the down position, lift my presser foot, pivot my fabric, lower my presser foot, and keep sewing. And then go ahead and back stitch and just stitch just a little bit over where you started. And then you can cut your threads. Now go ahead and repeat this exact same process on your lining fabric. Quilting your fabric like this is going to attach the cotton batting to the quilting cotton, which makes everything a little bit more stable. It also helps to keep everything in place if you do need to wash your bowl cozy sometime in the future. Next up, you're going to fold your fabric in half. So I'm folding it along these little dart cutouts that I have. And what I'm going to do is just pin these together because I'm going to be sewing along them. So just place a pin in here. You should have the right side of the fabric towards the right side of the fabric. And go over here and pin this one as well. And then I'm going to open this up, fold it in half again, lining up my other little cutouts, and pin those in place. Go ahead and repeat this process with your lining fabric as well. It's now time to sew our darts, so pull your sewing machine over, and we're going to start sewing at the raw edge of the fabric, and you're going to line up this cut edge over here with the edge of your presser foot. So I'm sewing this with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. So don't forget to backstitch this. And then sew all the way until you go off of the fabric. And you're going to repeat that same process on all of your darts. Okay, so you should have what's starting to look like your little bowl cozy. Go ahead and repeat the same process with your lining fabric. So you're going to be sewing all 4 of your darts. Step 5, sew your bowl cozy pieces together. For this next step, go ahead and place one bowl cozy out in front of you. Your right side of the fabric should be facing upwards. Go ahead and place the other bowl cozy inside with the right sides facing together. Now what you want to do is align all of your seams. So I'm going to come here to my darts. I'm just going to line these up. And if you want, you can offset these seam allowances so that it's not so bulky. And you can line up your corners, pin those in place. So just pin these all in place, making sure that you're lining up all of your fabric and these raw edges together. And it might mean that you have to shift things around a little bit. You're working with 4 pieces of fabric and the cotton batting is pretty thick. So you might have to wiggle it around until you get it just in the right position. Now you do want to leave a 3-inch opening along one of your straight sides, and this is going to be so that you can turn it right side out. So what I like to do is I take a pin with a different colored head and I place it in the opposite direction. And this serves as kind of a visual reminder to me that I need to leave this portion unsewn. So I'm just going to pin this right here. I'll probably put another one right here. And now I know not to sew here. So I'm going to sew all the way around, and I'm going to use that same technique that I did with my corners earlier. And I'm going to stop right there, leaving this little opening where I can push everything through. Come back over to your sewing machine and lift your needle up. So I'm going to start just right after that pin. Make sure that you backstitch as you begin sewing. And as I'm sewing these little inner corners, I like to stop, put my needle down and just pivot a little bit. This is going to help you to have a nicer corner. And then on this side, I'm just checking that everything is lining up over here so that I'm not missing anything, because you are sewing through 4 layers of fabric and it's easy to miss something. Now as I come to my corner, I'm going to put my needle in the down position, lift my presser foot, pivot my fabric, put my presser foot back down, and continue sewing. And that's going to give me a nice sharp corner. And then while you're sewing, you can always just check over here to make sure that you're sewing through everything, or you can come to the back and just double check that you're catching all 4 layers. And as I reach this point, I'm just going to pivot. Pivot one more time, and we're coming up on our opening. So I'm going to backstitch right here and stop sewing and cut my threads. So I have this little opening where I can turn everything right side out. Now you will want to make sure that you backstitch at the beginning and the ending of this hole. That's because there's a lot of stress that will be placed on the seam when you're turning everything right side out. Now that we've finished sewing everything, let's go ahead and do some trimming. Now, to reduce the bulk, I like to trim the corners off of my bowl cozy. You should be cutting close to, but not through, your stitching line. Then on this inner part, you want to snip into your seam allowance, and you're going to snip close to the threads but not through them. This is going to release the fabric, so when you turn it right side out, you don't have any pulling on that fabric. And make sure that you're not snipping through your corner. Just want to be cutting close to it. And now we're ready to turn this right side out. Go ahead and reach inside of the turning hole, and you can pull the bowl cozy right side out. So I'm just going to pull everything through this hole. You want to go slowly, not putting too much pressure on that turning hole. You don't want to rip it open. So just slowly pull your bowl out. Now, if you have a turning tool, you can go ahead and place this inside of your bowl cozy. Make sure that you are going inside of both layers of batting. And then you can use this to push your corners out. Push until you reach the very edge of that. So you can see that's giving me a nice sharp corner. And that looks really professional. I'm a bit of a perfectionist, but I love a good sharp corner. Do that on all of the other corners as well. Just repeat the same step. And you can see my thread starts to show once I've turned it all the way out. So I know it's all the way turned out. Now I'm just going to push my lining into my main fabric. And now I'm going to grab my iron and ironing board, and I'm going to press all of my seams. So make sure that your iron is turned on and that your heat is on high. I also like to make sure that my steam is turned on. And what I'm going to be doing is rolling out my seam allowance. So I take my seam allowance and I just roll back and forth until I get to the very edge of it. Then I can kind of finger press it, and I'm just pressing down on it with my fingers and my nails. And I kind of go around and do that to the entire thing. And then I go through and I press everything. So you can see sometimes things don't want to turn all the way out. When I'm pressing, I kind of turn it into its little bowl cozy self. And you have these little inside corners, and you want to press it just like this. Go ahead and press all of those seams and give them plenty of steam. And then I just kind of push my lining fabric into all of the little corners. And then I'm going to give it one more press. And you can see I still have all of my markings. Now, this is a water-soluble pen, so I'm just going to spray it with a little bit of water, and it will disappear. Next up, we are going to top stitch. Now, top stitching can serve two different purposes. It can be decorative and it can be functional. For a decorative top stitch, you can switch to a contrasting color of thread and slightly increase your stitch length. On the functional side, the top stitching is going to keep the fabric from shifting around. It also keeps everything in place if it needs to be washed. It's a really great way to give your bowl cozy a professional looking finish. You can just slide this under, and I like to line up the edge of my fabric with the edge of my presser foot. Because I don't want a 3/8 inch seam allowance here, I'm going to move my needle over. So you can see that it's moving over. I'm going to move it over as far as it will go. I'm also going to increase my stitch length. So right here, you can see I can increase to a 3. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. And then I do want to find that little opening that I have where we turned it, and I'm going to pin that. That way I make sure to give that a little extra care. Okay, so let's go ahead and start sewing. Now, as you approach this inner corner, you are going to want to pivot again like we did earlier. So stop right there when you hit the seam line, pivot your fabric a little bit, and then keep sewing. Go ahead and backstitch, and then you can cut your threads. I'm going to give my bowl cozy one final press. Just make sure everything's nice and flat on those seams. Also take a minute to clip any threads that you might have that are hanging around, especially if you plan on selling these. You want them to look really nice and neat. So I always take a minute to just make sure that it looks its best. Now you have your finished bowl cozy. I hope you enjoyed this sewing tutorial. If you did, give the video a thumbs up, share it with a friend, and subscribe to Sweet Red Poppy. I will be back next week with another fun sewing tutorial. Now, don't forget to post your finished bowl cozy on Instagram and use the hashtag #SweetRedPoppy. That way you can be featured in my Instagram stories. I'll see you next week.